Thank you so much, Tanya, for giving me this opportunity to interact with all these participants on a Sunday on this interesting topic of role of judiciary and executive in policy making. So I'll be discussing the topic more from a income tax standpoint, considering that is my domain area and the core area in which I practice. But generally, I'll give an overview of what my understanding has been when it comes to the topic in question. Now, to begin with, when we talk about the role of judiciary and executive in policy making, we are looking at an understanding that we have been given to understand, and which rightfully so is the case, that the domain of policy making is reserved only for the executive and the legislature, and it is not for the, I would say, judiciary or the judicial wing of the government to encroach upon or to transgress into. And it is only the state which, being aware of its resources, can devise policies, and they have to look into various parameters, which includes but is not limited to political will, budgetary consideration, and the resources at its disposal. At its disposal. And accordingly, all these factors, they play an eminent role in building the framework of the policy and how the policies have to be implemented and efficiently and effectively taken care of, because that is when the true purpose of the legislation that has been passed by the legislature will be achieved. And when it comes to the courts, as we understand, the limited purpose is just to keep a check on the actions of the executive and the legislature, that they do not transgress into the domain, or rather they do not violate the provisions contained in the article, the provisions contained in the Constitution of India, which basically mandate and give fundamental rights to the citizens and other rights to the people of India. So that is the limited role on a broader level that is there of the judiciary. Now, when we talk about these two entities that exist within the framework of the government or that of the state, we see that there is a separation of powers doctrine which exists under the Indian Constitution, though it has not been clearly spelled out. But the directive principles of state policy in Article 50, they specifically provide that the state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive in the public services of the state. So when we talk about these two wings of the government, it basically says that the judiciary should be kept independent of the state, and the executive, rightfully so, should be kept in check and should work as a separate unit. And therefore, they should not be overlapping. But when we talk about in practical sense and in realistic, taking into account realistic considerations, we will often come across scenarios wherein there has been an overlap when it comes to both the wings of the government or the state, wherein the judiciary has transgressed or has encroached upon the powers and it has taken upon itself to formulate certain public policies. And there have been instances, or rather there are instances which are rightfully there in some of the statutes, which basically provide that quasi-judicial authorities have been created out of the executives. Now, before we understand what exactly has been the case when it comes to public policy making, the role of the judiciary and that of the executive, I would just like to give a brief overview of the judiciary in India and the roles and responsibilities of judiciary in India, and so goes for the executive, and what are the roles and responsibilities of the executive. Now, when we talk about these judiciary, just one thing, do I answer these questions that are popping on my screen as and when the session goes on, or should I take them up during the end of the session?
That's up to you, Shashank, whatever you deem fit.
Okay, so I'll take as many questions as possible during the session itself. Let's make it an interactive session. So one of the questions is, what are the examples of such overlaps of the judiciary and the executive? Okay, so later on I was planning to discuss, but I'll be happy to discuss these overlaps now as well. So when I talk about the overlap, taking the example of executives in the first instance. So when I talk about executive, the executive can be broadly divided into two categories. One is the permanent executive, the other is the temporary executive. Now, when we talk about the permanent executive broadly would include the officers that are working directly under the control and under the government of India, which includes the IAS officers, to simply put it. And when it comes to the temporary executive would be the Prime Minister, the Council of Ministers, with the Prime Minister, his advisors, the various committees that are set up. So that will be temporary executive. So one is permanent, the other is temporary because every 5 years there is an election to the office and then there is a new executive that is in place. Now, when we talk about the overlap that the question points out, see, the overlap in this case would be talking from an income tax standpoint. There is a level of hierarchy that is maintained when it comes to the Income Tax Act. So the level of hierarchy basically classifies that certain actions are to be performed by tribunals, high courts, and Supreme Court, whereas certain actions and functions are to be performed by the officers within the Income Tax Department. Now, when we talk about these functions that are to be discharged by the officers of the Income Tax Department, they discharge certain judicial functions as well. And one of them being the first appellate authority. So to that extent, I feel that there is some sort of an overlap between the clear demarcation that has been spelled out by way of directive principles of state policy in the Constitution, that from the executive side, the executive is also performing certain judicial functions, properly known as quasi-judicial functions of adjudicating on appeals that are filed by the SSCs. Now, when it comes to the judiciary, the judicial functions where I see that there is an overlap, some of the recent and some of the landmark cases have been in that of Vishaka versus the state of Rajasthan, where the Supreme Court had directed that it promulgated guidelines for protection of women against sexual harassment at workplace. Similarly, the case of DK Basu, wherein guidelines were provided for arrest of certain persons, not certain person, but arrest of persons when arrest is made by police. So these are some of the instances where I see that though in the Constitution there is a separation of power, however, to this extent, I see that there is some overlap that is there between the judiciary and the executive. We'll see more of these instances when we move forward when it comes to the Income Tax Act, because that is something which I feel has been one of the most important areas where these examples are more glaring and more apparent. Now, moving on, as I was discussing about the judiciary and the executive, though I provided information about the executive, the roles and responsibilities of the executive are that the implementation of the law should be correct, effective, and efficient is one of the prime and the main purpose of the executive. And if this is not fulfilled, then the executive is said to be failing in its duty of performing these functions properly. Now, in the executive branch of the government, the policies, they are basically given a concrete shape, which takes into account manifold considerations as to how the particular policy has to be implemented, because the role of the legislature or the judiciary is, or the role of the legislature is very limited and restricted to the extent that they only pass the law as it is. And with obviously this comes with the rider or the fact that they have to debate it out and whether it is in line with the constitutional provisions or not. But the ultimate effect to that law is given by the executive, which is the Prime Minister and the various committees that are there. So that is one part. That is the roles and responsibilities of the executive. Now, when we talk about the roles and responsibilities of the judiciary, now traditionally it has been understood that the role and responsibility of the judiciary has been to interpret the law, to lay down the law, and to ensure that justice is secured for all the citizens and the people of the country. Now, this has been a very classical approach that has been there when it comes to judiciary. Now, when we talk about the role of the judiciary in public policy, the Supreme Court exercises a great amount of influence in these public policies are either formulated by the government, that is the executive, or it itself lays down considering a very dynamic approach and a dynamic interpretation which it gives to the Constitution. Now, just to give a brief overview, if you refer to Article 13(2) of the Constitution, it basically provides that the state shall not make any law which is in contravention of the Constitution, and if any law is made in contravention of the contravention to the articles of the Constitution, then in that scenario, the law shall be void. Now, this has been the case since I think 1950s and 1960s. But after that, you must have heard of the terms such as judicial review and judicial activism, wherein the court has adopted a very proactive approach in ensuring that fundamental rights of the individuals and the people are not affected, and the grievance that people have against the state, they are addressed, and wherever the state transgresses transgresses the provisions of the constitution, the remedy is there with the people. Now, the first approach wherein we talked about there has to be the interpretation of the law only by the Supreme Court, that's called a very technocratic or a technological or a very technical approach of the Supreme Court, and most of the authors have highlighted so. But after 1960s and 50s, considering the case laws that have come into place, wherein the Supreme Court has taken a very liberal interpretation of the Constitution and to ensure that justice is secure to the individuals and to the people, it has taken a very dynamic approach, and which has helped in the Constitution to evolve. So that is something that the court has done, and the Constitution has evolved. So these are the two approaches that have been there. Now, these two approaches are very relevant when we consider the point of judicial review. Now, when we talk about judicial review, the public policy formulation or the role of the judiciary when it comes to keeping a check on the executive is more prominent from judicial review point of view. Now, the courts, as I had earlier mentioned, that the role is very limited when it comes to interpreting and adjudicating the law that is there before it, and formulating policies also by taking a more dynamic approach towards the provisions of the Constitution. Now, when it comes to the present scenario, the different courts, whether be it the Supreme Court or the High Court, they have taken a very dynamic approach in interpreting the Constitution and the public policy. However, this specific power of interpretation of the Constitution or laying down of public policy is very much enshrined in the doctrine of judicial review. It is because of this doctrine of judicial review that the check is kept on the executive. And unless the Supreme Court or the different high courts that are there, they did not have, if they did not have the power of judicial review, there would not have been any possibility of keeping a check on the executive. Now, when we talk about like what are the instances or scenarios wherein the exercise of judicial review can be done by the Supreme Court or the different high courts, is only limited in scenarios where it feels that yes, there is an action or there is a law that has been made by either the legislature or implemented by the executive which needs correction, or they have transgressed into a territory which does not belong to them, that it should be struck down. And when I say that they have entered into a territory, or when they have taken an action which is contrary to the public policy, I mean that they have done something which is not in accordance to the Constitution of India. So it is only in these scenarios that the exercise of judicial review is done by the Supreme Court and the high courts that are there in the country. Now, the power of judicial review, again, as I mentioned earlier, is again a very subjective approach when it comes to the exercise of power of judicial review. Although there is considerable jurisprudence on the subject, that the exercise of judicial review has to be done only in cases where there has been a breach of the constitutional duty which is there on the executive. However, there have been instances where, taking a more dynamic approach, the courts have held that looking at things from a different perspective, the executive or the legislature has acted in contravention of the Constitution. And therefore, we feel that we have to step in and we have to exercise our duty. And therefore, they have said that taking a more proactive approach, the action of the executive is not justified. However, going by the literal interpretation, the approach should be restricted only to interpreting the law and laying down the law. However, again, I would like to qualify it by saying that both the schools of thought exist, and there have been a lot of public debate on the point that whether the Supreme Court should actually enter into the domain of public policy making or not. But time and again, it has entered into that domain, as we'll be seeing from an income tax point of view as well. But to give it generally, the prime examples are that of Vishaka versus the state of Rajasthan and the DK Basu guidelines that have been provided by the Supreme Court. And the foremost being the Vishaka versus state of Rajasthan, wherein the 2013 law was implemented with respect to those guidelines, and which effectively was a codified, is in fact a codified law now The other thing which I feel when it comes to judicial review and the inherent power of the court. Okay, there's one more question. Is ambit of suo motu action a part of this judicial review? So I would say that the suo motu action can also be said to be a part of this judicial review, primarily because if you see the articles contained in the Constitution of India, they basically say they give the power to the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution in a manner which is in consonance with the purpose for which these provisions were enshrined or envisaged in the first place in the Constitution. So when we talk about the suo motu cognizance being taken by the Supreme Court, that is again a very dynamic approach that has been taken by the Supreme Court or the different courts that are there of exercising judicial review, wherein they themselves take it upon themselves to decide whether a particular executive action is in line with the provisions of the Constitution or not. Prime examples of the same being in cases of the pollution that is there in Delhi, the Supreme Court suo motu took cognizance, and there are various other examples wherein the Supreme Court has taken cognizance of certain pressing issues that are there in the country. So I was talking about the power of judicial review. Now, apart from the approach that is there of judicial review, one important point that I would like to highlight over here is the existence of Article 141 in the Constitution of India. Now, Article 141 of the Constitution of India basically talks about that where the Supreme Court has decided a certain specific point relating to a law, that shall be the law of the land. And that is quite evident when it comes to seeing case laws, as I mentioned earlier, the Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan and the D.K. Basu guidelines. Also, these are two prime examples which I'm putting again and again. But if we refer to other areas as well, wherein when we talk about cases relating to dowry deaths, the Supreme Court has clarified that there cannot be an automatic arrest when it comes to cases of dowry death, and there has to be a preliminary investigation. And upon the preliminary investigation being carried out, that the officers have to be satisfied that yes, it is a fixed case, it is a fit case for making the arrest, that the arrest will be made. And only then, after requisite permission, that the arrest can be made. So these are some of the cases wherein the exercise of judicial review has been taken into consideration, or the power has been exercised judiciously by the Supreme Court. And as I was referring to Article 141 is the article which has been often used, or rather is the provision which should be referred to while reading a Supreme Court decision on a particular point of law, that this, unless it is overturned by a larger bench decision or something to the contrary already exists, and the Supreme Court has erred in deciding a particular law, that this will be the law of the land. So yes, the ambit of suo motu action, according to me, would be very much within the purview of judicial review. Now again, moving on from here, now what kind of what are the kind of actions that can be challenged before the Supreme Court when it comes to the action taken by the executive? I would say that it would only be restricted to where the action is not in accordance with the Constitution. So where the government of India or where the government of any other state has taken a policy decision based on certain parameters, and it can justify why a particular policy decision has been taken. So until and unless the court is satisfied that the rulemaking authority has not acted arbitrarily, till then the court will not exercise the power of judicial review. That it will be restricted only to examining whether there has been a violation of any of the provisions, or it is going to severely affect the public policy already in place, and it is going to severely affect the citizens of the country or the people in general. Now, one of the prime examples of this has been one of the cases that has been decided by the Supreme Court in the case of Fertilizer Corporation Kamgar Union, wherein the Supreme Court, while highlighting its power, highlighting its jurisdiction to exercise the power of judicial review, they say that we cannot usurp power from the executive and take it upon ourselves every time to decide a particular point of law and to frame a public policy to that effect. It is only when the executive has failed to carry out a particular action, or the action is not in accordance with the constitution, that we will interfere. Otherwise, if there is a decision that has been taken, though in the opinion of the court, it may be the case that the decision is not a wise one, however, it is in accordance with the policy, then the court cannot sit as a super auditor in that case, and it can audit the decision taken by the decision taken by either the government or a public company in that scenario. So basically, the Supreme Court said that our powers are limited only to the bounds of the Constitution. If there is anything to that effect, only then we will interfere. Otherwise, we will not interfere. The Supreme Court, when we talk about the economic laws that are there in place, whether it is the GST or the income tax or other laws to that effect, the IBC or the Companies Act, then in that scenario, the Supreme Court has categorically laid down and has clarified that when it comes to the economic statutes, the government has to be given a wider latitude to operate because of the inherent complexities that are there in these laws. When it comes to the other laws which have a socio-political impact on the society as a whole, the latitude of the government is very limited and restricted, and it has to act strictly in accordance with the measures that are provided in the Constitution. However, when I say this, I do not mean that when it comes to the economic policy or the economic laws that are there, the government can act in variance of the Constitution. It has to be in line with that, but not every economic policy will be challenged and will be entertained by the Supreme Court or the different high courts that are there. And that the Supreme Court has held that the government has to be allowed to have some play in the joints, because it is obviously a very complex and very diverse scenarios exist when it comes to the economic laws that are there. The Supreme Court also clarified in some of the major decisions that the court cannot strike down a policy because it merely disagrees that this should not have been the case, and rather we feel that this should have been the case. So a particular scenario may be seen very differently by the Supreme Court and very differently by the government. However, that itself will not be a ground. The policy has to be challenged and it has to satisfy the test on the anvil of reasonableness and that it violates the Constitution, the constitutional provisions. So considering all these points, the Supreme Court and the various high courts, they have said that the government has to be given a free power. However, they have to act within the bounds of the Constitution. And the free power is more when it comes to the economic laws that are there in place, and less when it comes to the socio-political impacts that are there. The Supreme Court has also clarified in multiple decisions that if something has to be challenged when it comes to policy decisions that have been taken by the government, that can be challenged before or rather at the floor of the parliament, where the elected representatives of the people are sitting. And there they have been given the mandate to debate it out, whether a particular policy of the government is in accordance with the benefits that it goes on to provide to the people or not. But it cannot be one of the grounds to challenge it before any of the high courts or the Supreme Court. Now, when we move on to the more, okay, there's one more question talking about economic laws. So the question says that can the court intervene in the farm laws that have been passed recently if farmers file a PIL? See, that again is a very subjective question. But if you ask me, it has to be shown to the Supreme Court. The court, I don't know if the court would want to suo moto enter into that domain. Even if a PIL is filed by the farmers in the present case, then in that scenario, again, you will have to check the statute that is there in place, which is to be challenged, whether it is unreasonable in any manner or it violates the provisions of the Constitution. If that is the case, then yes, there can be a valid ground for the Supreme Court to entertain that PIL, that it affects the public at large and it goes against the fundamental policy, the fundamental principles that are there in the Constitution. So therefore, until unless these tests are satisfied, I do not see a ground that these challenge can be maintained in the court of law, because challenge is one thing and entertaining that challenge and giving a verdict on that is another thing. So you may be free to file a PIL, or the farmers will be free to file a PIL, but the ultimate decision on that or a verdict on that will be dependent on the point that whether it is in any way violating the principles of the constitution, the basic principles that are there. If it does so, there will be a sufficient ground to challenge it. Again, it will depend on what provisions do we really want to challenge. Is it the entire statute we want to challenge, or only certain provisions are to be challenged? Again, there will be diverse permutations and combinations that will exist in this scenario, because if you want to challenge a particular provision, and that particular provision, if itself is challenged and has the effect of bringing down the entire statute, that is to say, that if that particular provision itself is contrary, based on which the entire statute is standing, then the entire statute has to go. But coming back to your question, it will depend on an analysis of the farm bill that is there. If it violates any of the provisions of the constitution, then in that scenario, yes, it can be a valid challenge before the court, and accordingly the court will be required to entertain that, whether it will be required to give its opinion and its judgment on the point that whether it is actually going against the principles of the constitution or not. Now shifting our focus rather to the income tax laws. Now, some of the case laws that I thought would be relevant for the present discussion from income tax standpoint. Now, I'll be basically covering, when it comes to income tax, three broad scenarios. The first and foremost being where the Supreme Court itself exercised the power of so-called judicial review to lay down a certain procedure which does not exist in the statute. The first case is that of GKN Drive Shaft. Now, this is a judgment of the Supreme Court. Now, just to give an overview or a background of what this judgment talks about, there is a provision in the Income Tax Act which provides that if you have filed your return of income and that return of income accurately and properly discloses your income and your income is assessed to tax, then you are good to go. However, if you have concealed certain information from the Income Tax Department, the Income Tax Department, by virtue of a provision in the Income Tax Act, has the power to reassess your income. Now, this power to reassess the income is there in section 147 and 148 of the Income Tax Act. This power can be exercised. However, there are certain checks and balances that if there is no fault on the part of the taxpayer in disclosing, then in that case you cannot go beyond a period of 4 years and go ahead and reassess the income of the taxpayer. However, if the assessee itself or the taxpayer has itself concealed the particulars of his income, has not accurately discharged the burden that was there, then in that case the Income Tax Department can go for reassessing the income of the taxpayer. Now, when we talk about reassessment, then in this scenario, the reassessment provision basically says that reassessment will be done in the same manner as the assessment is done. However, the assessees and the taxpayers have time and again challenged this executive action of the Income Tax Department, saying that this would mean...
Just a second to remind all of you, we have 10 more minutes to go, so you can design the session according to the leftover. And guys, ask questions if you have any. There is 10 minutes now left. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Tanya. So when it comes to exercising of the power of the reassessment, there is no specific procedure that has been prescribed in the statute, which basically says that these are the steps that have to be followed by the income tax officer while carrying out reassessment. So in this scenario, the Supreme Court laid down a particular procedure which does not exist in the statute, and it said that before carrying out any kind of reassessment, the assessing officer is first required to obtain a return of income from the assessee. Then the assessee is required to obtain the reasons from the Income Tax Department. Then those reasons are to be challenged by the taxpayer, and then the challenge has to be disposed by the tax officer, and then the assessment has to be carried out. Now, these elaborate guidelines, they have been formulated by the Supreme Court, and by virtue of Article 141 of the Constitution of India, they very much form part of
the law of the land. So therefore, this process has to be followed. And this is something which has been laid down by the Supreme Court now. So this is one example where I feel the Supreme Court exercised the power of judicial review, and they have laid down a particular law which does not exist till date in the income tax provisions. Now, when we talk about the other income tax cases, so this was one example where a policy was laid down by the Supreme Court in one of the cases. Another example, or rather a very good example of judicial review, where the Supreme Court exercised restraint also, is that of the case of A. Sannyasi Rao. Now, just to give a background of what we are looking at in this case law, prior to 1988, there was a lot of businesses that were happening for a period of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and not more than that. A lot of the people used to earn money and then they did not pay tax. So over a period of time, the income tax department gathered a lot of information, and through their experience, they learned that a lot of people are not paying taxes. Their businesses are getting wound up, and we are not even able to catch hold of certain people. Even if we are able to catch hold of certain people, they are not maintaining true and accurate books of accounts of their profits and gains and losses that they are making. So we are not able to assess them properly. So in the year 1998, a provision was introduced in the Income Tax Act, which is called Section 206C. The Section 206C basically provides that whenever a buyer goes to any seller, then the seller, while selling the goods, has to charge a certain amount of money over and above the consideration as TCS, which will be a percentage of the consideration. Now, this the amount of consideration or the over and above rate that was levied by virtue of the Section 206C by 1988 amendment, this was challenged before the Supreme Court. Now, the challenge before the Supreme Court was on the ground that this is unconstitutional. Unconstitutional in the sense that it is an impediment to the trade under Article 19(1)(g). And when it comes to Article 14, it creates an unreasonable differentiation between same class of people. Now, the ground was that the certain classes of people, they were dealing in certain kind of liquor, Indian made foreign liquor, certain forest produce, they were left out from the levy, and only a certain class of persons were included. Now, when the Supreme Court was entertaining this plea, they referred to the memorandum that was issued to the Finance Act, by which the provision was introduced. The Supreme Court, while looking into the memorandum, they said that when we talk about the provision that has been introduced, we must give it to the government that they had perfectly justifiable reasons for introducing this kind of a levy, because this has been shown to be a case where people are not filing their income tax return, they are not discharging their tax dues, and therefore the government was perfectly justified. As far as the differentiation that was carried out, the Supreme Court said that there is no differentiation that has been carried out. Each one is left to carry out its own business, and if they want to change their line of business, then they can do so. However, the government was perfectly justified in creating this kind of a classification because the statute provides them that they can levy tax on any person or any class of persons or any trade or specific industry also. And the Supreme Court also went back to the judicial precedents, which basically provided that the government has to be given a wider latitude or a wider playing field to create laws which are beneficial for the country as a whole. So therefore, this is one example where the Supreme Court upheld the experience that was gathered by the Income Tax Department, that where there is a revenue leakage, the Supreme Court can, where the Parliament is free to formulate policies, and the Supreme Court will not interfere in these kind of policy matters until and unless there is shown that it is unreasonable and the classification is bad in law that has been created. Another case law that which I thought I would discuss is that of GlaxoSmithKline. Now, just to give an overview of why I'm going to discuss this case law is this, I feel, is one of the case laws by which the Supreme Court exercised, I would say, a dynamic exercised its power of judicial review and interpreted the Constitution in a dynamic manner in making suggestions to the government of India that you have a policy of providing, in fact, benchmarking the international transactions that are entered by two enterprises which belong to the same group or to the same promoters, and wherever they deal on an arm's length basis, that is accepted by the government. And whenever they are not dealing on an arm's length basis, as in there is some foul play that is involved between two companies, then the income tax department can intervene and they can make suitable adjustment to the income, and then they can charge the tax accordingly. The Supreme Court in this case made suggestion to the government of India that you have a policy for international transaction very well, but when it comes to domestic transactions, you should lay your eyes on the following fact, that when there are two companies who are held by the same group, it may be a possibility that one company is making a lot of profits and the other company is making losses. Now, in this scenario, the company making losses would want to take over the profits of the profit-making company, and the loss-making company would want to pass on its losses to the profit-making company, so that the revenue impact would be neutral and there will be no outlay of tax from both the companies. So considering this scenario, the Supreme Court in this case made a suggestion to the government of India that you should make a policy, and this is our suggestion. This decision came out in 2010, and in 2012 there was a provision introduced in the Income Tax Act which provided for benchmarking of transactions between two related entities, and which was called as specified domestic transaction. The provision though does not exist now, and the provision exists but in a very limited capacity. It basically says that if you are obtaining an income tax benefit, only in that scenario the specified domestic transaction would come into picture. However, generally the provision does not apply. But yes, these are some of the instances